Okay. As I was saying, I'm not sure exactly where you stopped hearing me, but I was saying that the pivot table feature is certainly one of Excel's finest features. It's a great analytical tool, and it's the ideal tool for managing or helping you to understand what's in a large list. Now, it's a little bit difficult to define a pivot table without seeing one. And I imagine some of you have seen one, maybe worked with them a little bit as well. In this session, we are going to be creating a number of different pivot tables, and it will extend over 2 separate Fridays, an hour each. Let's start with the idea that we've got a lot of data maybe. Here's a list here, and imagine some people who work maybe out of a central office, or maybe they're salespeople who work out of their homes. They work for a major distributor of appliances, and they sell products, 5 different major products in 4 different regions to 5 or 6 different customers here. Now, all the different salespersons can sell products in different regions, and customers can buy different products from different salespersons in different regions and so on. So we'd like to make sense out of this. And what is it that we do in Excel? If you're using Excel 2013, that's the version I'll be using, the ribbon menu system, which is also, that's been around for Excel 2007 and Excel 2010, gives us certainly a variety of data management tools on the Data tab. First and foremost, probably is sort. The data we see here below is not sorted in any particular order. You can see that, but certainly we would do that if we were trying to make some sense out of this data. Scroll up and down after we sort it. You can sort by product, region, customer, whatever. And filtering certainly is helpful too. That allows us to hide the data that we don't want to see right now. And another major tool also on the Data tab is Subtotal off to the right. So if we have the data sorted, say by product, for example, we could introduce subtotals by product. And in a certain sense, that's leading us into the idea that what we really would want to be able to do quickly and faster than we can do with Subtotal, and do more than just subtotaling, but what we'd like to be able to do in a sense is pull together some of the aspects of Subtotal and filter and sort in a way that's going to let us get to our data fast and quickly. Now, you can't just say, I've got a bunch of data, therefore this pivot table is going to help me analyze it. You have to have your data structured. And the term list you might have heard of in prior versions of Excel. When we talk about a list of data, and Excel no longer uses that term in its documentation, but any kind of casual use of the word list, where you've got row after row of data, column by column here, and you've got a heading on top, this is what we're talking about. If you've got a list where maybe you've got some names and then some subtotals, a few empty rows and then some other names and some subtotals, a list that's structured like that is not a good candidate for using a pivot table. So, a few prerequisites. If we want to be able to use this feature, this new feature called pivot table, and think of it as a separate entity in the way a chart is. A chart is separate from your data, yet dependent upon it. A pivot table will be separate from this data, and yet it will be dependent upon it. We want to make some sense out of this data. We want to analyze it quickly. Now, this particular list has about 900 rows. I'm going to double-click the bottom edge of the active cell just to show you, remind you a quick way to get to the bottom of the list there. It's over 900 rows. From some people's perspective, that's a lot of data. From others, that's not very much at all. We have over 1 million rows, of course, in Excel. So we want to make some sense out of this. Imagine, after looking at this for a while and more or less figuring out what's going on, recognize that it covers data over a 2-year period, and we're tracking items sold and the dollar amounts out here in column G. What if we wanted to quickly come up with a list showing our salesperson's names down the left-hand side and our regions across the top? I've done this manually off to the right in column I. I'm going to make column H a lot narrower now, and we can see a list like I was talking about. How easy would it be to create this list without a pivot table? Well, as it turns out, maybe not so easy. Here's one of the formulas here in cell J4. I'm going to double-click it. Isn't that easy? Isn't that fun? It's a sum-ifs function. Those were introduced in Excel 2007. Now, a good proficient Excel user, not having looked at the data for too long, being asked to come up with something like this, it's going to take 10 to 15 minutes to structure these formulas and to verify that they are working correctly. So, although doable and it looks great, fine, Could we do this in a better way? With a pivot table, we can do this in about 5 seconds and no formulas in sight. It's going to be a lot easier. And furthermore, if we were looking at this and someone said, well, yeah, I see the region breakout, but could you do this by product instead or by customer? And your answer might be, if you were not using pivot tables, well, give me 5 or 10 minutes or so, I'll come back to you with that. We want to do it instantly, and that's practically the way we'll be able to do it with a pivot table. We will easily be able to change this to be either customer or product and see a different breakout of the data. Now, as we do this the first time, of course, I will need to spend a little bit of time explaining what I'm doing, so it will take longer than 5 seconds. But after this example and some subsequent examples, I think you'll see and recognize that creating a pivot table is generally pretty easy. And the feature itself is not usually complex. I think part of the problem could be if you hadn't heard too much about it and you're trying to learn how to use this off the printed page. Now, I've got a number of different Excel books and they do a good job at what they need to do. But with a pivot table, there's a certain visual aspect to it, a motion aspect that doesn't always come across on the printed page. So I think it's really valuable when you're learning about pivot tables, either to be watching a webinar like today's session or perhaps a live training session. So let's create a pivot table. The prerequisites are our source data is row after row of data with no empty rows within it. Now, we could have empty cells. We don't in this case, but that would be okay. We don't have any empty columns within that data. And the third requirement, and this sometimes requires a little bit of adjustment, you want to get your titles into a single row on top. Now, I've got a title above this in row 1. That's fine. Keep that isolated from the main part of your data. Either put in an empty row, and by the way, you could hide the row if you wanted to. But that's usually what I do if I need to have an extra title up there. But redesign these titles, put them into a single row. And by the way, if you somehow needed to have more text here, something like that, like if I somehow thought it was appropriate to have consumer product here, instead of making the column wider, I can type consumer and press Alt-Enter, and that does a line break, and I can press Enter. So stack up your data this way. Keep your titles in a single row. And that makes sense not only for pivot tables, but when you do sorting and filtering and subtotals, it's always best make sure your titles are in a single row across the top of the data. And make sure there's a title for every one of them too. That helps you avoid certain problems and issues. Didn't really need to do this here, so I'll press Control-Z and go back to that. So let's say we've identified this data. We do not have to highlight all of it, like I'm about to do here. That's not necessary. As long as we know no empty rows or columns in there, and we've got our titles together on top, click on a single cell. We're going to go to the Insert tab. Oddly enough, it's not on the Data tab. On the Insert tab, where we see the option for Pivot Table. Now, a bit later, I'll come back and show you recommended pivot tables. This is a feature that's new in Excel 2013. You will not see it in Excel 2010 or older versions at all. I'm just going to choose Pivot Table, first time around here, just Pivot Table. When you see this dialog box, most of the time it's pretty quick. You do a quick look here to recognize that Excel has figured out the extent of your data, A3 to G912. If we go with the default settings, we are going to be creating a pivot table on a new worksheet. Now, over time, you might decide that usually that's what you want to do. That's fine. You certainly have the option of putting the pivot table on the same sheet as the source data. So I'll simply go with the defaults here, click OK. We're about to see a new worksheet. And off to the left, a pivot table placeholder. Now, off to the right, you'll see Pivot Table Fields, a dialog box. This could be what we call docked. I'm going to double-click its title. It might appear against the right-hand side of your screen that way. If you prefer to have it floating, as you saw it earlier, you can click and drag its title bar out here. Now, as of now, if you've not worked with pivot tables, you might not have a rationale for doing either one of those. So either way, it's going to work fine. But it's all important because as we work with pivot tables, think of this, the lower portion of this as being a map of the pivot table. That won't really sink in until we see a few examples. Okay, we want to create a pivot table looking like that data that we saw earlier. I'm going to check the box for salesperson. Watch the left side of the screen. That's a unique and alphabetized list of all of our salespersons. I'm going to click the box for items. That's a numeric field. It's going to go to the right of that data. Now, you might also have recognized when I clicked the box for salesperson, not only did we see our salesperson's names over in column A, but in the lower portion of our pivot tables fields list here, we see salesperson down here. You see it listed there. And when I click the box for items, that's a numeric field, it automatically went into the so-called values area here. It says sum of items. Now, the third thing I'm going to do is a little bit different because we don't want region to appear along with salesperson in the rows area. So we drag region into what's called the columns area. As soon as I let go, off to the left we see a pivot table containing the same numbers that we saw before. The total before was 7999. Willie Loman is our best performer. That's 1064. I'll quickly jump back to the previous sheet, and here's the manual creation of that with those long formulas. There's the 1064, there's the 7999, and all the other numbers are the same. But here we had those long formulas as I showed you earlier. What do we have in the pivot table here? Not a formula in sight. So it was relatively easy to create. I could have done it faster too had I not been talking. Now, when we create a pivot table, sometimes we're thinking, well, let's look at the data. You might be an analyst working by yourself for the moment. As you do, I think the terms row labels and column labels are certainly not obtrusive. If you were making a presentation, however, or if you were about to print this, I think you might not want to see these terms here. But let me point out and emphasize what they mean. And the reason they are important for you to know as a creator and user of pivot tables is that when you look at the pivot tables field list over on the right, this lower area that earlier I had suggested was like a map of the pivot table, and you can make it larger or smaller if you wish. Think of rows, and we see 4 terms here, but rows down the left-hand side, columns across the top, the regions here. So you want to get familiar with the concept of where they are in the pivot table. The numbers that we're tabulating, and it's usually, but not always, a numeric field, appears here in the so-called values area. Okay, if you don't want to see row labels and column labels, there are 2 options. One is, and by the way, you might also have recognized, we've got a new ribbon, so to speak, in the ribbon menu system. It's called Pivot Table Tools with 2 new contextual tabs, an Analyze tab and a Design tab. Now, when you work with charts, you see a Design tab, but it has different elements in it. These 2 buttons here, Analyze and Design, bring us features available to work with when we're using pivot tables. If I click outside the pivot table, for example, if I click up in cell B2, watch the ribbon menu system get altered, return to its standard look, like that, and also that pivot table field list to the right disappeared. Click back within the data, and the pivot table fields list returns, as do our additional tabs up in the ribbon menu system. Now, if we don't want to see column labels and row labels, one thing we could do, this probably isn't the best thing, but it's okay. On the Analyze tab in the ribbon, off to the right, headers. I'll just check it. It disappears. And now we don't have any headings. Now, in some cases, you could say, well, it's pretty obvious these are regions. It's pretty obvious these are salespersons. So fine. Some cases, not a problem. Other cases, you might want to see them. So a better approach is leave it there, at least for the moment, and then go to the Design tab. And in the Design tab, third button from the left is Report Layout. Now, this is not all obvious or intuitive, but right now, the view that we are using is called a compact form. That really doesn't mean a whole lot unless you're using multiple fields in row labels, and we're not doing that right now. So outline or tabular, I suggest, is something you should do almost every time you create a pivot table, because both of these, you can use either one. Tabular shows grid lines, outline doesn't. They both do show the field names that I think most of us would want to see. And particularly if you were making a presentation, you'd want to see those terms there. Now, certainly standard features of Excel are at work here. So, for example, if we wanted to make the columns narrower, all of them, we could click in the upper left-hand corner, double-click a column boundary. A lot of people know how to do that, readjust the column widths. We could make these be right aligned, of course, from the Home tab. Not too critical here, but you know, we can make those kinds of changes as you would expect. Now, earlier I had suggested, what if you were making a presentation of the data? Maybe it's a sales meeting, and after discussing some of the numbers, the highs, the lows, whatever, someone has already asked, could we see the products here instead of the region? If we were looking at those long formulas that we saw earlier, it would take some time. This isn't going to take very long. Excuse me, not take very long at all. I'm going to uncheck the box for region and simply drag the word product into columns. And there we are, a quick readjustment of the column widths, and there it is. Pivot table field list off to the right, and now we're looking at the breakout by product. It's still the same grand total. Willie Lundman still has 1064, but obviously the layout of the numbers, the display, and the content of the numbers is different. We're looking at the data in a different way. And you can imagine all the different cross comparisons we could be making as we do this too. Another person might say, could we compare product with region? So let's uncheck the box for region. And by the way, you can also drag this off the field list to that way if you wish. Now, I'm going to check the box for region. Earlier I'd done this with salesperson. Both of those are what we call text fields. So is product, so is customer. When you check a box for a text field, it automatically appears in the rows area. So there's region, and we see it down the left-hand side. Now, you say, gee, that might look better if we somehow could take this data here and pivot it from the upper left-hand corner. The word pivot isn't really used very often, other than the fact it's the name of the feature, but it is derived from the concept that sometimes when we're looking at the data, we'd like to pivot it in such a way that, you know, these items were down the left-hand side in column A, and these are across row 4, for example. So let's pivot the data. It's not a single action. So all we're going to be doing here in the pivot tables is flip the order, the location of product and region. And so in no particular order, I'm going to drag first product into rows. Watch the display. Not a bad display, really. Not compact, of course. I'm going to drag region from its rows location into columns. And we have this layout. And remember, too, when you work with a pivot table, and probably a lot of you when you work with Excel in general, remember that sometimes you take an action, yeah, I'm not sure if I want to do that. Control-Z will let you undo your last action and press it again to undo the previous action. So I just press Control-Z twice. How do I reverse stream and reconsider what I just did? Control-Y, Control-Y. So it's not uncommon to press Control-Z, then Control-Y to go back and forth a little bit. Sometimes you're not sure about the layout. One thing to be sure, though, is don't hesitate to move these fields in different locations. Not that they're all going to be great, but sometimes the data will jump out at you in a way that you hadn't thought it was going to. If you know this data from the beginning, if you've got a good feel for it, as we say sometimes, if you've got a good feel for the data, putting these fields in different locations sometimes is, you almost develop instincts, and you don't want to, in any sense, think, gee, that was a wrong move. No, just make another move. Move these around so that you're looking for that ideal layout maybe. Or maybe you have some instincts about what it is you're trying to show and isn't quite working until you just happen to use certain fields in a certain way. Rest assured that no matter what you do here, this is not going to affect or alter your original source data. And it's not because the source data is on a separate sheet as it is here. It's because when you work with pivot tables, the design of the pivot table concept keeps your original data safe. Now, all the examples we've seen so far are showing a comparison here between two major fields and then a numeric field. But what if somebody looking at this says, you know, what I'd like to see a breakout of these products by region and then show the customers involved. So I'm going to drag region, which is currently in the columns area. I'm going to drag it and put it below rows, or put it in rows below product right here. And recognize that left to right in the pivot table, we've got product and region. In the pivot table's field list, top down, we've got product and region. So when you're looking at these two together here, and you don't have to click them, but we see product region top down. Now, if I drag product downward and put it under region, watch the pivot table to the left. Now region is the leftmost field. So at different times you'll prefer one layout over the other. And if we wanted to bring in customer as a columns label, we won't check its box because it would automatically go into the rows area. We'll drag customer into columns like that. Now, there will be times when this is just fine as a pivot table. In other words, maybe it's on the printed page. Be a little bit careful, a little bit cautious when you're working with data. If you were to make a presentation, for example, this might be a bit too much data here. In other words, people are saying, too many numbers, TMI, that sort of thing. So there will be times when the pivot table display could be okay for you, the analyst, working by yourself or on the printed page, but when you're making a presentation sometimes, this is just a bit too much. So you want to think out a few things. Okay, we're back. I hope you can all see this, and I might have to backtrack just a little bit. What I'm going to do now is create that pivot table real fast because I was unable to resurrect the file that I'd saved. So active cell is here within the data. Insert tab, pivot table. Okay. Check the box for product and region and drag customer to the columns area and items to the values area. And there we are, looking at a list like this. And on the design tab, I'll change the report layout to be tabular and zoom in a bit. So we saw this display earlier, and I was commenting on the idea that at different times, pivot tables, we tend to think of them as being compact, and yet at times that's a flexible term. One thing to consider here is, do we really need to see the subtotals here? Now, sometimes yes, sometimes no, but recognize that on the Design tab in the ribbon, leftmost button, Subtotals, first choice, do not show subtotals. So there we are. So that could be a little bit cleaner. But I want to suggest something I'd said earlier here too, repeated. When you're looking at two fields side by side, like product and region, consider the opposite view where you just flip the order of those. And we do that within the pivot table fields dialog box. So I'm going to drag product downward here, below region, and we just saw what happened over here. So consider that option. And I didn't readjust the comments here, so I'll do that quickly. Double click there. So again, at different times as you move these fields around, you have different perceptions about the numbers you're trying to show, the totals, and whether it's too much detail or not. And those, of course, will vary with your audience. Now, what I'd like to do is shift gears and go to a different worksheet, totally different in content, but recognize that here too, there's some potential. I'm going to click a cell here and then double click its bottom edge to point out that it's got 742 rows or so of data. And recognize too, we do different things with data. Some people looking at this might say, well, I'd like to give a list, for example, of each building and how many people are in each building, maybe by department, something like that. Maybe this company is on a campus-like setting. We've got 4 or 5 major buildings here, and you might want to see a breakout like that. Another person looking at this, maybe an HR person, might say, I'd like to see if there's any kind of correlation between years of service and compensation, or how about years of service and job rating? Any trends coming out of there? Any kind of correlations that might be interesting? Someone else might do it with age. Be careful with that one. And there's some other examples too. I'd like to look at, for example, how much each department is spending on compensation, and maybe have it broken out by status here. So let's do it. And this time make it a little bit different. Let's put the pivot table on the same sheet. Now, I don't think there's any strong argument for putting data on the same sheet, although sometimes it's just handy to have the pivot table right next to the source data. I don't think there's any additional security that you gain from it. Maybe there's a certain sense that says I just want to keep it separate, and that's fine too. So this time slightly different in the starting process. Let's say that we have identified our data as having no empty rows or columns in it. And here's a little tip too. If you haven't seen the data in a while, or maybe never, click inside the data, press Control-A. Now either scroll up and down, or better yet, start pressing Control-period a few times. This simply moves the active cell around the corners of this contiguous range. And what we're really doing here is like we're getting a preview as to see, we're getting a preview to see the data that will be used if we simply click in here and start creating a pivot table. And recognize a little bit different here too. We've got empty cells in this data, and nothing wrong with that. And based on the data that we're seeing there, it makes perfect sense. It's a benefits column. Not everybody has benefits. So we see what's happening there. So active cells within our data, let's create a pivot table, this time on the same sheet as the source data. So Insert tab, Pivot Table, choose where we want the pivot table report to be placed. Existing worksheet. Click on the location panel. I'm going to click cell L1. That's going to be the upper left-hand corner of the pivot table. Click OK. Scroll forward. There we go. Our source data, of course, is off to the left. All right, in this pivot table, I want to see department. That's a text field. I'll click its box. There it is, a unique list and an alphabetized list of our departments here. Always look in here for misspellings or duplicate types of entries. For example, in this list here, here's project and contract services. That's using the ampersand symbol, and looks like we got right under it, project and contract services, where it's spelled out. So there's a difference there. We'll deal with that a bit later, but do look for those kinds of things. Don't count on this being perfect all the time. In other respects, it's a unique list and it's alphabetized. If we want to show compensation, I'm going to check the box for compensation right here. It automatically appears as a values area, and you see it right there. We definitely will want to consider displaying those numbers in a more readable way too. And let's break this out by status. Now, if we simply check the box because it's a text field, it will appear as a rows field down the left-hand side. And although that's not an ideal display, it's not bad. It's got some merit, possibly. But I think a better approach here is to make status appear as a columns field. So I'm going to drag it into columns, into the columns area there. And there we go. Now, it's pretty obvious those numbers are just overwhelming in their current state. We need to see them, but we certainly need some commas. So first order of business might be to right-click, and you can right-click any one of these cells in here, even an empty one. So I'll just right-click. Logically, you probably right-click on one that has a number. Go to number format. I think in our example here, the best choice is going to be number using the commas for sure, but no decimals. And click OK. So it looks like that. Now there is another option that's unique to pivot tables that you probably should know about. If you are dealing numbers in the multi-thousands and millions, you might want to display these numbers in thousands. So for example, why not display that 192,900 as 192.9, or right here, display this as 100.2. We could do that. If you right-click these, like we did before, go to number format. What we could do here is go to custom and simply take the selected item there and click up in the empty panel here, not empty panel, but the panel just below type, and alter this so that it ends in 0.0 comma. Now this is a little trick actually. It's not, maybe not a trick, but it's not so well known. If you have a format with a trailing comma, it's going to hide 3 characters to the left of the decimal. Who would ever guess that? Click OK. Now we'll see these numbers in thousands. So that could be easy to read. And we didn't necessarily have to add the decimal. I did because I think it's commonly done, but don't have to do that. If we had put in 2 commas, it wouldn't work so well. It would be displaying these numbers in millions. So that number would be, for example, 3.2 had we put in 2 trailing commas. Anyway, just a thought here and an idea. I am going to go back to a more standard display because I think that's what most people would do. Control Z. Now, as in the previous example with a pivot table, row labels, column labels here, let's get rid of those and replace them with the actual field names. Design tab, report layout, choose outline or tabular. There we are. Department and status makes a lot more sense. So let's deal with this other issue. And as we do, this is going to bring out a major point about pivot tables. It might surprise you if you've not worked with them too. It looks as if we've got what? Project and contract services listed twice. And it's pretty apparent, based on the numbers, that the second entry looks like just one of our entries, and the source data was just entered incorrectly. Should have been put in this way with the ampersand. Someone spelled it out. $13,000. So let's go find it. In the list to the left, which happens to be sorted alphabetically anyway, and I've been through it before, so I can find it probably pretty quickly. It's down around row 580 or something like that. There it is in our list, almost. Okay. So right here. There it is. There's the difference. So what do? We'll simply drag this downward and correct it. So we're all set. But when we go back to the pivot table, and you might expect, based on your work with Excel formulas and working with charts and so on, what happens when you change the source data for a chart? What does the chart do? It reacts immediately. What if you change a cell that's being used in a formula? What does the formula do? It reacts immediately. Well, we just changed and corrected that entry over there so that it no longer has the word "and." So what happened in our table? Nothing. And the reason is that when you create a pivot table, and you don't necessarily know where this is happening, but in the background, your source data has been copied into a holding area. It's called the pivot table cache, C-A-C-H-E, and your pivot table works off that hidden pivot table cache, not truly the source data. So what we need to do when we make changes to the source data in the pivot table, if we want this situation here to be rectified, we've got to refresh the pivot table. And you can do it with a new keystroke shortcut, Alt F5, or on the Analyze tab in the ribbon, there's Refresh. Now, you don't really have to highlight the data here. I'm doing it to bring it out. I can have the active cell right here, for example. But this row, or these cells here, are going to disappear. All this is going to be moved upward. And this number, for example, that's going to go to what? 1,131,000 as we make a change here. So the active cells anywhere in here, I'll press Alt F5 to refresh. There we are. So those cells disappeared, this got adjusted, and now everything is in shape. So when you make changes to the source data, your pivot table is not up to date until you refresh it. And here's another concern. If we wanted to add a new record here, if we inserted some cells right here and pushed them down and added the data there, we would have to refresh our pivot table and it would work just fine. But if we add a record at the bottom, if we tacked on a record here and refresh the pivot table, that would not make a change. So we've got a couple of issues to deal with here and a couple of ways to work around that idea. First of all, I add new rows to the bottom of that source data, and I wanted to update this pivot table. One way to do it is to go to the Analyze tab in the ribbon and choose Change Data Source. Change Data Source. And then what I would do in the pop-up list here, which goes down to row 742, I would make sure that that goes down to row 747 if I had added 5 new records. So we do that. Now, maybe a better way, but it's a more long-term approach. If the original source data had been structured as a table, well, not everybody uses this feature, but if you'd converted your data into a table like what you see here, then if you add a new record at the bottom, it immediately becomes part of the table. In fact, we could add 5 records or whatever. But in these cases, if you add records at the bottom, a simple refresh takes care of them. In other words, your pivot table would recognize that these additional rows are part of this source data and no problem. Now, not everybody is working with tables yet. It was a new feature introduced in Excel 2007. Its primary, the primary reaction that most people have when they see it is the visual aspect, the banded rows, but it's got its own design tab and some other features. So it would take us a good 10 minutes to give it its full due right now, but nevertheless, it is a good reason to use tables if it's going to be a source for a pivot table. And it's too bad that we're using the word table in 2 different senses here, but that's just the way it is. Okay, back to the list here. Back to our pivot table, the one we just created here. Pivot table off to the right. Now, when you work with data, you can, we got some HR professionals looking at the data. Maybe they're going to make some suggestions to higher management about some of these numbers are alarmingly large maybe, or small, or whatever, and some of the numbers are jumping out. The numbers might be easier to read based earlier on what I'd said about displaying them differently, but also in the way that they're arranged here. Now, What if you were looking at this and said what you'd really like to do is to sort this data here? Well, first of all, we do not have to highlight the data. We can sort this pretty fast, as it turns out. If we want to sort this data on the basis of what's in the grand total column, all we need to do is not highlight the data, but just click somewhere out here in one of these cells. It makes no difference which one. And then on the Analyze tab in the ribbon, now, if we were using Excel 2010, this tab is called Options, and you would see an AZ button here, or ZA button. In Excel 2013, just go to the Data tab and simply click ZA if you'd like to sort this data in descending order. And there it is. So we rearranged all the rows here, top, bottom, based on the data in column Q. And for a while, and for certain people looking for the numerical, the focus is on the highs and the lows here. This brings out the data in a better way. Another person might say, could we sort this by full-time? We sure could. Click in column M and do a ZA sort. And that'll be pretty much the same, except we'll see the slight reordering of the rows this way. So now it's that way. And at a later time, if we want to alphabetize this list, we'll just click in column L and click AZ. And there it is. Now, what if we also wanted to show how many employees there are in each department by status? Now, we might want to keep the compensation amounts here as well. So we haven't done this yet, but it's certainly not out of the question. It's probably not the majority of pivot tables you'll see, but it's not uncommon to see multiple fields in the values area here. So on the pivot tables fields list, I'm going to check, or not check, I'm going to first of all consider which field we would put here in the values area. If we want to count the number of employees, it sounds like employee name would be the one to do, but that's a text field. What's going to happen if we put a text field in the values area? Well, Excel will recognize this as a text field, and obviously you can't add text, but you can certainly count the number of entries. So we're going to put employee name into the values area. And now we see a not attractive display. I'm going to zoom back a little bit. One adjustment I'll make right away, click in the upper left corner and readjust the column widths. It's going to help a little bit maybe, but not. So I wouldn't say completely unsatisfactory, but not exactly ideal. But here are a couple things you can do that are not obvious that are really going to help. Recognize how every other column here says count of employee name. Almost makes me think it's like a medieval title. I am the count of employee names. That's really an unwieldy phrase. I'm going to type right over. Now, if I type over one of them, the other three entries here are all going to change at the same time, and that's handy. So I'm just clicking one here in column N. You see it's also in column P and R and T. I'm simply going to type in head count. So much, oops. Yeah, there we go. As I press enter, watch columns P, R, and S. Same word will appear over there. Once again, quick readjustment of the column widths, that's going to help. Sum of compensate, that's kind of unwieldy too. I'm just going to say comp total or something like that, or total comp. Yeah, and here too I'll press enter, and that's going to take care of all four columns there too. So recognize what we have. I still don't think it's actually better looking than it was before we made some of these changes. We've got two columns here about full-time people, and their compensation amounts by department, and then two columns for half-time, and then hourly, and then contract, and so on, and also for the total. Now, you might have noticed, and I didn't point it out, but when I dragged the employee name into the values area, what also happened was there's a new field entry under columns. Now, of course, you can see it within the pivot table, but as we look at it here in the pivot table's fields list, it simply says what? Some values. I'm going to drag status below that. Now, watch the pivot table as I drag status below the values entry there. Now we've got our four compensation amounts together and our four head counts together. A lot easier to read than what we saw before. Like that. And if you somehow said, well, I want the head count to be to the left of all these here. Then in the values area of our pivot table field list, I'm going to take total comp, put it below headcount. Notice how the word headcount appears down there, even though when I drag the field in, it was employee name. So there. And now we've got this list. And I think that would be better than all the others we've seen so far. Still, though, I do recognize that from time to time, when you've got multiple fields here, it still might be a little bit crowded or maybe not an ideal display, but that certainly is an option. Now, there's another approach, too. You can simply copy a pivot table and then do what with that copy? Make it do different things. In other words, use different fields or lay it out differently. So it's not uncommon to have 3 or 4 pivot tables based on the same data, or data from the same data source, is a better way to say this. So let's imagine that instead of having one pivot table, what if we had 2 pivot tables, one showing headcount, another showing compensation? We could do that. And we could, of course, do different things with one of the tables and make it be focused on job rating or building, something like that. So a couple ways here. We can select a pivot table. I think most people are likely to click and drag it. That's pretty fast. You can also go to the Analyze tab and say Select Entire Pivot Table. You can do that. Press Control-C to copy. Off to the right somewhere, I'm clicking in cell X1, Control-V. For the moment, 2 identical pivot tables, but in the one on the left, I'm going to remove headcount. I'll just uncheck employee name. And then off to the right, I'll do the reverse here. I'll take out the compensation, uncheck the compensation box. And maybe get rid of the empty columns and so on. So now we've got 2 pivot tables. Displaying data differently. They're using the same fields, but well, not totally the same fields, because here we're looking at employee count. Here we're looking at compensation. But if we want to change this so that it shows the breakout of people by building, we could certainly do that. Just uncheck the box for status and drag building into the columns area. And so now we see a breakout of how many people are in each building based on the department they're in. Different layout, different view of the numbers completely. So you can see at different times how having more than one pivot table could be ideal. At other times, maybe putting the data together within the same pivot table. So we've got a lot of flexibility here. Now, something else you can do from time to time, and you could do it in kind of a show-offy way. I wouldn't suggest that's the way the feature was designed, but the building site manager is probably having a heart attack right now, recognizing that some people really are scattered. Some departments have their people scattered across way too many buildings. Well, maybe these buildings are interconnected or something, but anyway, we've got some numbers here that are causing people to kind of say, whoa, what's going on here? Now, maybe you're part of the site manager staff and you're looking at this and you say, I've been working over in the West building recently. I didn't realize, you mean manufacturing's they've got 15 people over there? Holy cow. Who are they? Double click. Oh, there they are. Well, what happened here? What was that all about? That's called drill down. So what did I do here? On the table, anytime you double click any number, any of these numbers, it's as if you're saying, go back to the source data. Now I did this right here on the 15. So what did I find? I got a list on a separate sheet of all the people who were in engineering maintenance who were in the West building. I simply double clicked. Let's take a look at that sheet again. It's displayed in table format. There are those 15 people. They're all in engineering maintenance, and they're all in the building West, in the West building. There they are, just like that. So this is called drill down. You can do this at any time. It's your way of saying, I want to make a copy of the relevant source data represented by these 19 entries, those 2, those 24, those 151, whatever. And we could do this with salaries over here, the compensation amounts here too. If I double click right here, and I don't know how many names we're going to see, but that's going to be a list of all the engineering people, engineering maintenance people, and all the information about them. It's called drill down. Now, if you make changes to the source data and you refresh your pivot tables so that they are up to date, what happens to these sheets? Nothing. So you want to keep an eye on them. Do you really need to have them around that long? If you do, you better label them. And keep in mind, though, that if you refresh the pivot table, these do not get refreshed. And so from time to time, they could become not accurate anymore. Think of these as the snapshot in time at the time we double-click. So that's a great tool at times. You need that. And let me again remind you of this whole idea of refresh here. To make this a little clearer, I'm going to hide some columns temporarily here and imagine a scenario where and hide. Imagine a scenario where two of the people in our one of the departments here, how about the ADC department, and I'll even hide some of this data. We don't need to see this right now. I'll just hide this for a moment, drag across, and right-click and hide. Imagine that these two people in the ADC department have been offered full-time positions they accepted. Now, in this list here, we're on status, we're seeing building, so I'll uncheck the box for building and drag status into the columns area and readjust the column widths. There we go. So right now in ADC, we've got 3 contract people and no full-time people. So I'm going to change these 2 entries here to be full-time. Remember, these are the people that accepted the full-time positions. Make a change there. What's happening in the pivot table? As you would expect, nothing has happened at all. That should be a 2 now, and that should be a 1, but it doesn't happen because we haven't done the refresh. So on the Analyze tab, I can click Refresh, or I can simply click Alt F5. Either way, but now it's refreshed, full-time 2, contract 1. And again, just a strong reminder, you've got to remember that when you make changes to your source data, whether on the separate sheet or not. Now, one minor thing here I want to bring out too. Earlier I'd said it's not unusual to see a pivot table in the same data as the source data. What if I were not thinking here, and I've got all my columns back. In fact, I'll click in the upper left-hand corner, right any column, and unhide so that all columns have returned. Maybe I'm looking at my source data. Maybe I've zoomed in using Control and the mouse wheel. For the moment, maybe I've forgotten the pivot tables over there. What happens if I try and insert a row here above row 4? Right click and insert. And in this new folksy way, as of Excel 2.13, the message is we can't make this change for the selected cells because it will affect a pivot table. So in other words, you can't do it because there's a pivot table off to the right. So if we truly did want to add a record there, what we would do, of course, is simply highlight the cells right here and then right-click insert. This time, of course, we would insert 3 dots there. Just shift the cells down. Of course, that would not disrupt the pivot table. Let me undo that. Okay. Something else that would have to see here, when you've got 2 pivot tables on the same worksheet, if I were to add a field to this pivot table that would cause it to run into the other pivot table to the right, that too is just blocked. So for example here, if I put years as a columns field, or try to drag it into here, I get the same message. A pivot table report cannot overlap another pivot table report. So now we're almost out of time for today. A few features that we will be talking about. We have not yet talked about a pivot chart. For some kinds of pivot tables, that's an ideal accompaniment to it. It's easy to create, and it gives you that visual that you sometimes need when people are confronted with a sea of numbers. It's going to be easy to use and helpful. It will be in sync with the pivot table at all times. There's a new feature introduced in Excel 2010 called slicers. We'll be talking about that also. That gives you a good way to control filtering and better than what you might have seen in older versions. And the slicers concept is ideal too because it's a feature that's going to be used in other areas of Excel in the future. Already in Excel 2013, you can use the slicers concept with regular tables that are not pivot tables. And we'll also talk about a new feature in 2013 called a timeline. And show you one of Excel's greatest capabilities when it comes to pivot tables, the ability to do grouping by date and time. And we'll also show you how you can use conditional formatting in pivot tables and also how to introduce calculated fields. So I think that's all we want to do for today. We had a slight interruption there, but that wasn't too much of a problem. And we'll be working with this same data. And what I'll do is I'll preserve this as well as the original version so that we can start off more or less taking up where we left off from here.
Well, thank you, Dennis.
That's it for today.
Thank you for the presentation today. So as you know, this is part 1. Part 2 is next Friday, same time, 11 Pacific Standard Time. This workbook and the PowerPoint slide are on vbaexpress.com. The link's there in the chat window for you. If you can't access it, please feel free to email me and I'll send you the link. Either later today or by Monday, a edited down version of this webinar will be on the video page of VBA Express for you to view as well, and all the previous webinars that we've done are on there now. So we appreciate everybody attending today. Hope you all have a great weekend and hopefully see you next week. Thank you, everybody.